Chapter 8, The Road to the Black Peaks. Mal woke with a start, his hand instinctively flying to the hilt of the broadsword resting beside him. The fire in the iron brazier had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, dim shadows across the commander's tent. Outside, the howling wind of the desolate valley had finally died down to a dull, whistling moan. But it wasn't the wind that had woken him. It was the sound of the heavy canvas flap being thrown back. Alice stepped into the tent, bringing a blast of freezing morning air with her. She looked entirely different from the terrified, exhausted woman who had collapsed by the fire the night before. Her damp hair was slicked back, her face was scrubbed clean of the glowing green dust from the library, and her eyes were bright and alert. "Where have you been?" Mal rasped, sitting up and rubbing the sleep from his face, his voice thick with confusion. He glanced around the tent. Poppet was still curled in a tight ball on one of the wool cloaks, but Mango was nowhere to be seen. Alice grinned, dropping a heavy armful of scavenged gear onto the dirt floor with a satisfying thud. "I woke up early. I was thinking about how we were supposed to carry all the supplies you found last night, and I decided to go on a little scavenger hunt of my own." She proudly held up two sturdy, weather-beaten leather backpacks. They looked like they had belonged to heavy infantrymen, complete with thick straps and multiple brass buckles. "And," Alice continued, her grin widening as she picked up the burlap sack Mal had brought in the night before, "I found a few more things." She tipped the sack over, emptying the contents onto the floor next to the dying embers. Out tumbled several more waxed paper bundles of dried meat, a tightly wrapped package of salted fish, and 3 full leather water skins. But the real prizes were the practical tools: a brass-rimmed spyglass, a compact flint and steel fire-starting kit in a small tin box, and sitting incongruously among the survival gear, a small, pale bar of lye soap. "I found a river," Alice announced, gesturing toward the soap. "Not far from the edge of the camp. The water is freezing, probably meltwater from the mountains, but it is clear. I used it as a bath." She shivered, pulling her heavy green cloak tighter around her padded tunic, but her smile didn't waver. "The coldest wash ever, but I feel amazing now. I highly recommend it." Mal stared at the pile of gear, then up at Alice, a slow, amused smile breaking through his unkempt, sun-bleached beard. "Are you telling me I need a bath, Alice?" Before she could answer, the canvas flap shifted again. Mango trotted into the tent, his sleek black coat looking impeccably groomed, though he gave his back paw a distinctly offended shake to rid it of the cold dirt. He walked over to the pile of scavenged food and immediately nudged the package of salted fish with his nose. "Yes," Mango projected, not even bothering to look up at the Scotsman. "I can smell you from here. You reek of old parchment, ancient dust, and terrified perspiration. It is highly offensive to my delicate sensibilities." Poppet uncurled from his spot by the fire, letting out a long, luxurious stretch. "For once, brother, I agree with you. The human is pungent." Mal let out a loud bark of laughter, running a hand through his tangled, grimy hair. He looked down at his rough linen tunic, which was indeed covered in bast sand, green bioluminescent moss, and sweat. All right," Mal chuckled, grabbing the bar of lye soap and one of the thick wool towels Alice had scavenged. He stood up, strapping his broadsword across his back out of pure habit. "I can take a hint. A freezing river bath it is." He paused at the tent flap, looking back at Alice with a genuine grateful smile. "Good work, Alice. Seriously, we're going to need all of this." Alice beamed, already kneeling down by the leather backpacks. "Go freeze in the river, Mal. I'll pack what we need for the next part of the journey." Half an hour later, the flap of the commander's tent pulled back again. Mal ducked inside, looking entirely transformed. The thick layers of ancient dust and glowing green spores were gone, his face and beard scrubbed clean by the freezing river water. He was shivering slightly in his damp linen shirt, but his blue eyes were bright and alert, the exhausted slump of his shoulders replaced by the sturdy posture of a seasoned traveller. He found Alice waiting for him by the cold iron brazier. She had organised their newly acquired armoury and survival gear with ruthless efficiency. 2 packed heavy leather backpacks sat side by side, straps tightened and buckles gleaming faintly in the morning gloom. "Well," Mal smiled, pulling on his thick padded tunic and heavy wool cloak, securing his broadsword tightly across his back. "I feel like a new man, freezing but new. Are we ready?" "Ready?" Alice said, hoisting the slightly lighter of the 2 backpacks over her shoulders and checking the slender sword at her hip. "I am also ready," Mango projected, trotting over to stand by Alice's leather boot. "Though I do hope this journey involves less scuttling subterranean horror and more immediate progress toward a warm fireplace." "The only warmth in this realm is born of dissonance," Poppet reminded him sharply, his dark coat ruffling as he moved toward the tent flap. "We seek Severin, brother. The warmth will come later." With a collective deep breath, the 4 of them stepped out of the sheltering canvas and into the pale, sickly light of the morning. The wind had died down considerably, no longer howling with the furious intent of the previous night, but the air remained incredibly bitter. They picked their way carefully through the blasted, glass-scorched craters of the ruined battlefield, keeping their eyes focused firmly on the towering, jagged teeth of the distant Black Mountains. They soon reached the river Alice had found earlier. The water was wide, shallow, and ran black over the smooth slate riverbed, fed by the melting ice of the distant peaks. They crossed at a shallow point, the freezing water barely cresting the tops of their sturdy leather boots. The cats, to Mango's immense vocal displeasure, were forced to carefully rock-hop across the widest section, Poppet leading the way with a series of precise, graceful leaps. Once across the freezing water, they found something unexpected. Running parallel to the river, cutting a straight, deliberate path through the jagged, broken rocks, was a road. It was faint, the paving stones cracked and swallowed by centuries of creeping moss and dark earth, but it was undeniably a road, and it was heading precisely in the direction of the Black Mountains. "An old supply route," Mal murmured, kneeling to brush the dirt from a large square paving stone. "Whoever fought here didn't just stumble into this valley. They marched along this road. I wonder where it goes to." "It is the path of least resistance," Poppet agreed mentally, his golden eyes scanning the horizon. "If Severin claims the peaks as his stronghold, this road should lead us to his door." They followed the ancient stone path. The stark, brutal landscape offered little variation as the morning wore on. Skeletal, twisted trees clung to the cracked earth like desperate fingers, their branches rattling dryly in the wind. The chaotic static of the dark magic hummed constantly at the base of Alice's skull, a low-level ache she was slowly learning to ignore. But the walking was steady, and the heavy wool cloaks kept the worst of the chill at bay. For most of the morning, they travelled in silence, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on old stone and the occasional distant crack of thunder rolling across the bruised purple sky. When the sickly grey sun finally reached its zenith, barely visible behind the heavy cloud cover, Mal held up a hand. "Let's stop," he said, his voice carrying easily in the desolate quiet. He gestured toward a large flat boulder sitting slightly off the cracked road, shielded from the wind by the husk of a massive dead oak tree. "We've made good time. We should rest and eat while the light holds." Alice dropped her heavy leather backpack onto the dry dirt with a grateful sigh, rolling her stiff shoulders. She unbuckled the main flap and retrieved the waxed paper bundle of salted pork and hard cheese, pulling a leather water skin from the side pouch. Mango was immediately sitting at attention by her boots, his golden eyes wide and hopeful. "I believe I earned a slightly larger portion of the pork today," Mango projected smoothly, his tail wrapping neatly around his paws. Considering the emotional trauma of crossing that freezing river without a proper bridge. Poppet hopped gracefully onto the flat boulder next to Mal, shaking his head. "You leapt over 3 small puddles, brother. Do not be dramatic." Alice smiled, tearing off a generous piece of the salted meat and tossing it to Mango anyway. She handed a chunk of the hard cheese and the water skin to Mal before sitting heavily on the boulder beside him. The cheese was incredibly dense and tasted faintly of ash, but the calories were desperately needed. Alice chewed slowly, her gaze drifting past the dead oak tree and fixing on the massive, jagged silhouette of the Black Mountains. They were much closer now. The sheer, terrifying scale of the peaks was beginning to block out the horizon entirely. "Mal," Alice murmured, taking a sip from the water skin, "you said Severin's magic creates dissonance. What exactly does that mean? What are we walking into?" Mal stopped chewing, his weathered face falling serious as he looked out toward the mountains. He set his hard cheese on the flat rock beside him. "The multiverse operates on balance, Alice," he began, his voice quiet and solemn in the desolate wind. "Think of the briarwood. It hums with natural resonance. It feeds the earth, and the earth feeds it back. But Severin, his dark magic doesn't share. It consumes." He gestured toward the cracked, dead landscape surrounding them. "He takes all the available power in a realm and corrupts it to his twisted needs. This unnatural use of power acts like a massive distortion in the fabric of reality. It's like a magical black hole. It creates a strong gravity that attracts evil, fear, and decay, and crushes everything else until there is nothing left." "That is why he stole our kin," Poppet projected, his mental voice cold and sharp as he stared toward the peaks. "He drained this realm entirely. Now he is siphoning the light of Bast to fuel his dissonance." Alice shivered, pulling her heavy green cloak tighter around her padded tunic. The low-level static buzzing behind her eyes suddenly felt a lot more sinister. Mal sighed heavily, reaching into his leather pouch to retrieve the brass-rimmed spyglass Alice had scavenged. He stood up on the flat boulder, extending the spyglass and bringing it to his right eye. He slowly swept the horizon, focusing intently on the base of the massive Black Mountains where the cracked road vanished into the gloom. "What do you see?" Alice asked, standing up beside him. Mal slowly lowered the spyglass, his expression grim. "A forest, or what remains of one. It looks like miles of burned trees and shattered stumps, and the road runs right through the middle of it." "Excellent," Mango muttered telepathically, finishing the last of his salted pork and giving his whiskers a fastidious wipe. "More dead things. I was just thinking this realm was entirely too cheerful." "We have to go through it if we want to reach the stronghold," Mal said, stowing the spyglass and picking up his pack. He checked the broadsword strapped to his back. "Let's move. We don't want to be caught in those trees when the sun sets." They packed up the remains of their meagre lunch and set off again, following the cracked paving stones toward the looming Black Peaks. By mid-afternoon, the desolate rocky plain began to give way to the edge of the ruined forest. The devastation was absolute. It was far worse than the shattered skeletal trees they had seen on the cliff. Thousands of massive ancient trunks jutted from the ash-choked earth, their bark scorched black and their limbs violently splintered, as if they had exploded from the inside out. A thick grey mist clung to the ground, swirling slowly around their leather boots as they stepped onto the road that cut through the graveyard of wood. The deeper they walked into the burned forest, the heavier the air became. The oppressive silence of the library had been frightening, but this silence was entirely different. It was suffocating. Alice realized with a sudden icy jolt of terror that since they had stepped through the portal, they hadn't seen a single sign of life. There were no insects buzzing in the grey mist. There were no tracks in the ash. There was no sight or sound of birds in the shattered canopy, nor a single animal scurrying through the blackened stumps. The only sound in the entire world was the crunch of their own boots and the soft padding of the cat's paws on the dead road. A profound primal sense of fear was starting to grow in the pit of Alice's stomach. Mal's words echoed in her mind, a strong gravity that attracts evil and fear. The dissonance wasn't just in the earth, it was seeping into her mind. "Stay close," Poppet projected sharply, his yellow eyes darting between the shadows of the burned trees. "The veil is thin here, very thin. Severin's corruption is thickest in the mist." Suddenly, Mal held up his hand, stopping dead in his tracks. His hand dropped slowly to the hilt of his broadsword. Mal whispered, "Do you hear that?" Alice froze, her hand instinctively flying to the hilt of her slender sword. The air in the dead forest was thick and heavy with the grey mist, muffling the usual sounds of their own breathing. Then she heard it. It was a slow, rhythmic thudding echoing through the ash-choked trees. Clip-clop, clip-clop. The heavy, deliberate sound of hooves striking the cracked paving stones of the ancient road. "Horses!" Alice breathed, her eyes widening in the gloom. "Off the road, now!" Mal ordered sharply, his voice hard with urgency. They didn't hesitate. Alice scrambled off the cracked stones and plunged into the thick, swirling grey mist, her boots sinking deeply into the soft, scorched earth. Mal followed closely behind her, grabbing her arm and hauling her down into a deep, ash-filled ditch just behind the massive, splintered trunk of a fallen oak tree. Mango and Poppet moved like living shadows, darting silently over the lip of the ditch and flattening their sleek black bodies against the charred bark beside them. Alice held her breath, pressing her back against the damp earth. The sound of the hooves grew louder, vibrating through the ground and into her bones. The oppressive silence of the forest magnified the noise until it sounded like a small army was approaching. But as the figures finally materialized through the grey fog, Alice saw it was only 2 riders. They were massive, riding side by side on heavily armoured war horses whose breath plumed like smoke in the freezing air. But it was the riders themselves that made Alice's heart pound against her ribs. They were both heavily armoured, but they looked entirely different, as if they had ridden out of 2 completely separate centuries. The rider on the left was clad in full, shining steel plate armour that clanked heavily with every step of his mount. A massive broadsword was strapped to his saddle, and the visor of his heavy helm was lifted, revealing a pale, grim face with eyes that looked entirely dead and devoid of light. The rider on the right was a stark contrast. He wore the intricate, layered, lacquered armour of an ancient samurai, dyed a deep blood red. A terrifying menpo, a demonic half-mask with bared iron teeth, covered his lower face, and twin curved katanas rested securely at his hip. They rode in absolute, terrifying silence, their dead eyes fixed straight ahead on the road toward the jagged black mountains. Alice remained perfectly still, her hand gripping the hilt of her sword so tightly her knuckles ached, until the heavy thud of the hooves faded completely back into the swirling mist. Mal slowly released his grip on his broadsword, letting out a long, shaky breath that plumed in the cold air. He peered cautiously over the edge of the fallen oak tree to ensure the road was clear before sliding back down into the ditch. "Did you see them?" Alice whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She looked at Mal, her eyes wide with disbelief. They looked completely different, like they shouldn't even exist in the same world. Mal nodded grimly, adjusting his heavy leather backpack. "A knight in full plate and a samurai. I've read about both in my studies on Earth, but I've never seen them riding side by side. The dissonance here is strong." "Perhaps they are from different realms," Poppet projected quietly, his golden eyes fixed thoughtfully on the spot where the riders had vanished. "If Severin possesses the power to tear rifts in the veil, to steal the magic of Bast, perhaps he has also collected warriors from across the multiverse to fight for him. Mango shuddered, giving his dark coat a quick shake to dislodge a patch of grey ash. A terrifying thought, brother. If that knight's armour is any indication of the standard issue equipment for Severin's army, I suggest we avoid direct combat. Our claws are sharp, but they are not made of steel. Poppet is right, Mal agreed, his expression hardening. Severin is pulling from everywhere. The distortion we felt earlier. This is the gravity of his power. He's attracting the most dangerous things he can find and binding them to this dead world. He stood up slowly, brushing the ash from his heavy woolen cloak. We need to be a lot more careful from here on out. If he has patrols riding the old road, that is a sure sign we are close to his stronghold. Alice climbed out of the ditch, her legs feeling shaky but her resolve solidifying. She checked the buckle on her slender sword, ensuring it was secure. Then we stick to the tree line. We don't walk on the road unless we have to. With a silent nod of agreement, the four of them slipped back into the grey mist. They abandoned the cracked paving stones entirely, choosing instead to pick their way carefully through the shattered, burned stumps of the dead forest, keeping the road in sight but remaining hidden in the shadows. The rest of the afternoon passed in a tense, nerve-wracking silence. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Every swirling eddy of the grey fog looked like an approaching rider. But they encountered no one else. As the sickly grey sunlight finally began to fail, bleeding away into a deep, bruised purple twilight, the dead forest abruptly ended. Alice pushed past the final splintered trunk of a massive pine tree and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Mal stepped up beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his broadsword. They had reached the foot of the mountains.